I'm Carmen Reinhart, and I am the Dennis Weatherstone Senior Fellow here at the Peterson Institute. I take great pride in the amount of work that I put into my book with Ken Rogoff. It's not just economics. I like to call it archaeology because it's actually digging up a lot of data from obscure sources and putting together a history of some of the financial catastrophes that countries have gone through.
Influential book with Ken Rogoff called This Time It's Different, the history of these financial cycles. And basically, over-leveraged countries, debt crises, problems like this take a very long time to work out of. Where are we in that cycle? You and I talked about a year ago, you said we had a long way to go.
We still have a long way to go. The deleveraging process, which is something we still have ahead of us, is by no means close to complete. Households still have a great deal of debt. The real estate industry and the real estate sector is still in the doldrums. And the government has amassed and continues to amass a great deal of debt. All that put together still leaves us with quite a haul ahead. Recovery notwithstanding, what the decade following a financial crisis holds in terms of growth is subpar, is muddling through rather than a very robust environment.
The emerging markets, who really don't want Europe and the U.S. as their neighbors, and are attracting huge capital inflows and seeing a tendency towards currency appreciation, although both of these things sound like Switzerland, you have a very different problem. You have the fear that you're going to have some overheating issues, that you're going to run into too much borrowing, too big current account deficits, all those kinds of risks. This crisis, like most of the crises that we document, begins with a spark in financial innovation, securitization of mortgages, but most importantly, that translates into a lending boom, a borrowing frenzy. And in the United States, this is happening. This is happening in Spain. This is happening in the UK. It's happening in Ireland. It's happening in Greece. And this lending boom is fueled by borrowing from abroad, big current account deficits, large capital inflows, borrowing from abroad to finance those deficits. And not surprisingly, when you have a lending boom that goes on and on, the quality of your lending begins to deteriorate very markedly.
Now, interest rate was kept low. What was the rationale for that? Why did the Fed do that?
I think the main reason one can point to is that monetary policy in the United States and in most economies, certainly the advanced economies, has a price stability objective. And inflation was certainly not raising its head in a way that was alarming. So the case for the kind of very tight money, for example, that we saw in the late 70s, early 80s, when we were trying to bring inflation down, you couldn't really make a case for that. But I importantly want to highlight that it's the perfect storm component of it is that you not only had domestic liquidity, but you were also borrowing heavily from abroad. Very large current account deficits, persistent, I may add, current account deficits, have been a hallmark of crises in advanced economies and emerging markets before World War II, since World War II, whichever way you want to slice the sample.
Since World War II, this was not the case in pre-World War II financial crisis, but in post-World War II financial crisis, there's a blur between what is private debt and public debt. That is, what are private debts before the crisis become public debts afterwards. The most extreme case of that is Ireland. Ireland had debt to GDP of 30%. By any metric, it had an incredibly tight ship on the fiscal side. Now, Ireland's finances are pushing on Italy's and will probably overtake Italy, not because the government had a Greek-style chronic problem of overspending and inability to raise revenues, but because they took on massive amounts of bank debt. In the US, we had Fannie and Freddie. In 2010, Fannie and Freddie were shifted. If you look at the flow of funds statistics from the Federal Reserve, in 2010, the Fannie and Freddie were shifted from the private sector balance sheet to the public sector balance sheet. That transfer was 25 percentage points of GDP. So the general government debt in the United States, general government includes federal, state and local, and government enterprises. And Fannie and Freddie became a government enterprise. And that added 25 percentage points in one shot to our general government debt. So between the government taking on private, and this is continuing in Europe, okay? Let me say that this is not an academic point that I'm making. This is as we speak. Europe is poised for another major round of bank recapitalization.
Thank you. The title of your book is ironic, actually, because there are many similarities between past financial crises and the one that we just went through are still in. And one of those is that every time there's a debt buildup, everyone has a good excuse as to why you don't need to worry about it this time. What does that tell you about our ability to head off the next crisis?
The next crisis. Well, the next crisis will probably not be here. It will be somewhere in another part of the world where they will say, no, that happens in the United States, but not here. I think what history tells us is that for a while, our memory of this crisis will be alive and will make us more prudent towards debt and towards saving and so on. But then we forget.
Inevitably, we forget. Where do you think we are in the recovery, based on your research into the past?
Ken and I have chronicled the major financial crises, and for the post-war period, we would be right on the mark around the bottom, or just having seen the bottom. That's the good news.
What's the bad news?
The bad news is that crises do take a while. Even those that recover with strength and vibrance take a while to get us back to where we were, meaning from where we are to recovering the income level where we were before the crisis is about 2 years.
2 years? I thought you were going to say 7. That's actually better than I thought.
But here's the worst news. This is a global crisis. And that is one of the concerns I have about the magnitude of the recovery. The issue of debt overhang is something that looms very large over all the advanced economies, whether it's the US, Europe, or Japan. The debt overhang in both public and private debts is very far from resolved. In the financial industry, we still have the problems of too big to fail with this. And in the US, employment has begun to show signs of recovering, but in many parts of Europe, the unemployment situation remains as dire as ever. And so I would hardly call the task finished or nearly finished.